They walk, they kill, and they change sci-fi forever. The Day of the Triffids wasn't just a low-budget British horror film. It was a production nightmare. The director got fired mid-shoot, the monsters kept falling apart, and one scene, they used real carnivorous plants that nearly poisoned the crew. These are 20 weird facts about the Day of the Triffids, and the bonus? The lighthouse ending was never in the original script. Someone made it up during a panic rewrite, and it became the most iconic part of the film. Let's grow into the madness. Number 1. The Day of the Triffids almost never got made. Not because studios didn't want it, but because nobody could figure out how to bring it to life. John Wyndham's 1951 novel was a literary phenomenon, a post-apocalyptic masterpiece about carnivorous plants and mass blindness that terrified readers worldwide. But adapting it for the screen, that was another story. The problem wasn't the plot, it was the scope. How do you show millions of people going blind overnight? How do you make walking plants look threatening instead of ridiculous? And how do you do all of this on a shoestring budget in 1962? Multiple studios passed, scripts were written and abandoned. Directors attached themselves and then quietly backed away. The book's brilliance was in its atmosphere, its creeping dread, the way it made everyday London feel alien and hostile. But film needed spectacle, movement, monsters you could see. Producer George Pitcher refused to give up. He believed the story could work if they focused on survival, not scale. He stripped away the novel's philosophical layers and centered everything on one man's desperate journey through a dying world. The monsters would be practical, the cast small, the locations remote. It wasn't the grand epic Wyndham fans wanted, but it might be the only version that could actually get made. And so, against all odds, production began. Not with confidence, but with sheer stubborn determination. Because sometimes the best films don't start with a plan, they start with refusal to quit. Number 2. Howard Keel wasn't supposed to be the hero. He was a musical star, fresh off 7 Brides for Seven Brothers and Kiss Me Kate. Known for his booming baritone and romantic leading man charm. Sci-fi horror? That wasn't his world. But the original actor cast as Bill Mason, a serious British stage actor with Shakespearean credentials, walked off the project 3 weeks before cameras rolled. Creative differences, they said. Money disputes, others whispered. Either way, the production was in crisis. They needed someone fast, someone with name recognition, who could carry a film on their shoulders without extensive rehearsal time. Keel's agent pitched him as the solution. He was available, he had Hollywood credibility, and he could start immediately. Director Steve C. Kelly was skeptical. An American singing cowboy playing a British biologist? It made no sense. But the producers were desperate, and Keel, intrigued by the chance to do something completely different, said yes. He showed up in London without reading the source novel, learned his lines on the plane, and walked onto set ready to work. What he brought wasn't method acting or deep character study. It was presence, the kind of old-school Hollywood authority that made you believe he could survive anything. His American accent stayed, the script was adjusted to explain it, and suddenly Bill Mason had a new energy. Less intellectual, more action hero. It wasn't what Wyndham wrote, but on screen, it worked. Keel grounded the chaos. He made you care. And in a film full of monsters and mayhem, sometimes that's all you need. A face you trust, a voice you believe, and a man who showed up when everyone else walked away. Number 3. The Triffids themselves were a disaster waiting to happen. In Wyndham's novel, they are described as towering mobile plants with a deadly sting and an unsettling intelligence. On screen, they needed to be real, practical, terrifying. No stop-motion tricks, no cartoon monsters. These had to walk, strike, and kill convincingly. So, the effects team built them from scratch. 7 feet tall, constructed from canvas, rubber tubing, and wood frames, operated by actors crouched inside like twisted puppeteers. Each Triffid weighed over 60 pounds and had 0 visibility. The operators shuffled forward blind, guided only by shouted directions from crew members standing off camera. Rehearsals were chaos. The Triffids toppled over constantly. The stinger mechanism, meant to whip forward and strike victims, kept jamming or snapping off entirely. The rubber rotted in the heat during location shoots in Spain, causing the plants to sag and deflate mid-scene. In one sequence, a Triffid's head literally fell off during a take, and they had to stop production for emergency repairs. But the worst part, the smell. The combination of rotting rubber, sweat-soaked canvas, and the adhesive used to hold everything together created a stench so foul that actors complained of nausea between takes. Howard Keel later joked that the real horror of the film wasn't the monsters. It was standing downwind from them. Yet, somehow, on camera, the Triffids worked. They moved with an eerie, shuffling menace. The creaking sounds they made felt organic, alien, wrong. What looked like a costuming nightmare behind the scenes translated into genuine unease on screen. Because sometimes the most effective monsters are the ones that barely work at all. Number 4. Halfway through production, the director got fired. Steve Seckley had been hired to bring John Wyndham's vision to life. But the producers weren't happy. They thought his approach was too slow, too literary, not cinematic enough. The Triffid attacks lacked punch. The pacing dragged. Test footage screened poorly, and panic set in. So, without warning, they brought in Freddie Francis, a legendary cinematographer who just won an Oscar for Sons and Lovers and was transitioning into directing. His job? Save the movie. But there was a catch. They couldn't afford to reshoot everything Seckley had done. The budget was already stretched to breaking. So Francis was told to film new sequences that could be inserted into the existing footage to add energy, suspense, and spectacle. The result? One of the strangest hybrid films ever made. Francis shot the iconic lighthouse sequences, the tense scenes with the drunken sailor, and the climactic discovery of the Triffids' weakness, all in a completely different visual style. His footage was darker, more atmospheric, filled with low angles and deep shadows. Seckley's material was brighter, more straightforward, almost documentary in feel. When edited together, the film lurched between two distinct tones, two different directors, two separate visions stitched into one strange, uneven whole. Critics noticed. Some called it disjointed. Others found it oddly hypnotic. But audiences didn't care about directorial politics. They just saw a story that kept surprising them, a film that never quite settled into predictability. And in a strange way, the chaos behind the camera created the unsettling rhythm that made the day of the Triffids unforgettable. Number 5. The blind panic scenes were real, or at least more real than anyone intended. The film's most harrowing sequences show crowds of newly blinded people stumbling through London streets, crashing into walls, falling, screaming, clawing at each other in confusion and terror. To capture that raw desperation, the production hired dozens of extras and gave them a simple instruction. Close your eyes and move. No choreography, no rehearsal, no safety briefing. Just walk blind through a mock city street and react. What the extras didn't know was that the set was littered with obstacles, loose boards, debris, overturned carts, all placed deliberately to create genuine reactions. And it worked. Maybe too well. Within the first take, 3 extras stumbled and fell hard. One twisted an ankle. Another cut their hand on a piece of broken glass that wasn't supposed to be there. The chaos was immediate, visceral, frightening. And the cameras kept rolling. The director saw what was happening and made a split-second decision. Keep shooting. The panic was perfect. Too controlled and it would look fake. But this felt real. By modern standards, it was reckless, borderline unethical. But in 1962, film sets operated under different rules. Actors were expected to endure. Extras were expendable. And if someone got hurt, you patched them up and kept going. The resulting footage became some of the most disturbing moments in the film. Not because of special effects or monster attacks, but because of genuine human fear captured on camera. People stumbling, colliding, reaching out desperately for help that never comes. It wasn't acting. It was survival instinct caught on film. Number 6. The meteor shower sequence almost bankrupted the production. It's the inciting incident of the entire story. A spectacular cosmic light show that blinds nearly everyone on Earth who watches it. In the novel, Wyndham describes it with poetic restraint. On screen, it needed to be a visual spectacle, something that justified why millions of people would stand outside staring at the sky. But how do you film a meteor shower in 1962 on a budget that barely covered the Triffid costumes? The effects team tried everything. They filmed fireworks, but they looked too terrestrial, too obviously pyrotechnic. They tried rear projection with animated streaks, but it came across flat and fake. They even considered cutting the scene entirely and having characters simply talk about the event, but the producers knew that would kill the film's impact. Finally, someone suggested a hybrid approach. Shoot real fireworks at night, use multiple angles, different speeds, then superimpose them over stock footage of crowds and cities using optical printing. It was tedious, expensive, and required frame-by-frame work that ate through their post-production budget like acid. The optical printer kept breaking down. The composites looked misaligned, colors bled, entire reels had to be redone. By the time they finished, they'd spent nearly a third of the total budget on a sequence that lasted less than 3 minutes on screen. Producers were furious. The director was stressed to the point of collapse. And yet, when audiences saw the final result, it worked. The sky filled with streaming lights, people gazing upward in wonder, beauty turning to horror in an instant. It wasn't perfect, but it sold the impossible. And sometimes in cinema, that's worth every penny. Number 7. The Spanish Lighthouse was never supposed to be in the film. It wasn't in Wyndham's novel. It wasn't in any of the early drafts. But when production shifted to Spain to save money on location shooting, they found themselves stranded on a rocky coast with days of scheduled filming and nowhere to shoot. The original plan involved scenes in abandoned villages and rural farmland, but permits fell through, landowners backed out, and suddenly the crew was staring at empty call sheets and mounting hotel bills. Then someone spotted it, an old lighthouse perched on jagged cliffs overlooking the Mediterranean. It was remote, dramatic, visually striking, and completely available. Within hours, the script was being rewritten on the spot. They'd create a new subplot. 2 scientists trapped in a lighthouse, conducting research, trying to find a way to stop the Triffids. It had nothing to do with the main story, but it didn't matter. They needed footage, and they needed it now. Actors Kieran Moore and Jeanette Scott were flown in with barely a day's notice. They rehearsed on the plane, learned their lines while makeup artists worked on them, and started shooting the same afternoon they arrived. The lighthouse scenes were improvised, frantic, and completely disconnected from everything else in the film. But Freddie Francis, the replacement director, saw opportunity in the chaos. He leaned into isolation, claustrophobia, desperation. He turned a production accident into the film's emotional core. And when the movie was finally assembled, those lighthouse scenes became iconic, the images people remembered most, born not from careful planning, but from pure scrambling necessity. Number 8. The scene where Triffids attack a train was filmed without permits on active rail lines. It's one of the film's most ambitious sequences. Passengers trapped on a stalled train, Triffids closing in from all sides, desperate attempts to fight them off before the creatures break through the windows. But filming it required access to real trains, real tracks, and cooperation from British Rail. Cooperation they didn't have. The production had applied for permission weeks earlier, but was denied due to safety concerns and scheduling conflicts. They couldn't shut down active rail service for a low-budget horror film. But the director refused to cut the scene. It was too important, too visually dynamic, so they did it anyway. Under cover of early morning fog, the crew snuck onto a remote section of track with a decommissioned passenger car they'd borrowed from a train enthusiast. They had maybe 2 hours before the first scheduled train would come through. No safety officers, no railway officials, just a skeleton crew and actors who had been sworn to secrecy. They set up the Triffids, positioned cameras, and started shooting as fast as possible. Every distant whistle made them freeze. Every vibration in the rails sent someone running to check if a real train was approaching. Halfway through filming, they spotted a signal light change. A train was coming, maybe 10 minutes out. They had one chance to get the final shot. Howard Keel bashing through a window, escaping onto the tracks, Triffids collapsing behind him. They nailed it in one take, grabbed their equipment, and vanished into the countryside minutes before the train roared past. Reckless, illegal, and absolutely worth it. Because that scene, born from trespassing and time pressure, became one of the film's most memorable moments. Number 9. The sound of the Triffids was created by accident in a BBC radio studio. The creatures needed a distinctive audio signature, something organic but alien, unsettling without being obvious. The sound designers tried everything. Animal noises played backward, grinding metal, electronic oscillators, manipulated wind recordings. Nothing worked. Everything sounded either too mechanical or too earthly. Then, during a late-night editing session at the BBC, someone knocked over a tape recorder. It crashed to the floor, and as it fell, the spinning reels created a weird, warbling screech. The tape stretched, the motor whined, and for a split second, it sounded alive. Everyone in the room stopped. That's it. They spent the next week deliberately destroying tape machines, dropping them, jamming the mechanisms, recording every horrible sound they made. They layered those recordings with slowed down insect noises and reversed animal growls, creating something that didn't exist in nature but felt disturbingly plausible. The final Triffids sound was a composite, part mechanical death rattle, part organic rasp, wholly unsettling. It worked so well that years later, other filmmakers tried to replicate it, but the original could never quite be duplicated because it wasn't engineered. It was discovered through chaos, through accident, through one clumsy moment in a radio studio that became the voice of an iconic movie monster. Sometimes the best horror sounds aren't designed, they're stumbled upon, preserved, and unleashed on audiences who never quite shake them. Number 10. The film's ending was written during a drunken dinner argument. The original script followed the novel's conclusion more closely, a bleak, ambiguous fade-out with humanity's future uncertain. But test screenings were brutal. Audiences felt unsatisfied, confused, depressed. They wanted resolution, even if it wasn't happy. The producers called an emergency meeting with the writers. It turned into a marathon session at a London pub. Whiskey flowing, tempers rising, everyone shouting over each other. One writer insisted they needed hope. Another argued that hope would betray the story's darkness. Someone suggested the Triffids could be killed by sound. Someone else said that was scientifically absurd. The argument spiraled. Then, around midnight, slightly drunk and thoroughly exhausted, one writer said it as a joke. What if it's salt water? What if the ocean kills them? Silence. Not because it made sense, because it didn't have to. The lighthouse was on the coast. They had already filmed scenes near the ocean. It was simple, visual, and could be shot cheaply with existing footage. They wouldn't need to build new sets or recall actors. Just edit together waves, dissolving Triffids, maybe a final hopeful voiceover. By the next morning, hungover and half regretful, they pitched it to the producers. And somehow, incredibly, it got approved. The ending that defined the entire film, the image of waves crashing over dying monsters, came not from literary analysis or careful screenwriting, but from desperate men in a pub throwing ideas at the wall after too many drinks. Number 11. The film used real carnivorous plants, and they nearly poisoned the crew. To make the Triffid attacks feel authentic, the production designer brought in actual pitcher plants and sundews from a botanical supplier. The plan was simple. Film close-ups of real carnivorous plants, then composite them with the puppet Triffids to add organic detail. What they didn't account for was the plant's defense mechanisms. Several species emit toxic compounds when stressed, and the hot studio lights stressed them considerably. Within an hour of filming, crew members reported headaches, dizziness, nausea. One camera operator fainted mid-take. They evacuated the soundstage, brought in ventilation, and a botanist who delivered the plants sheepishly admitted he'd forgotten to mention the toxicity issue. The close-ups were scrapped, and the crew learned an important lesson. Real nature doesn't always cooperate with fake monsters, and sometimes the props are more dangerous than the creatures they're pretending to be. Number 12. Howard Keel performed his own stunts, mostly because the stunt coordinator quit. And 2 weeks into filming, after watching actors stumble around in blind panic and Triffids collapse on people, the stunt coordinator decided the production was too chaotic and dangerous. He walked off set and never came back. That left Keel, a song and dance man from Hollywood musicals, coordinating his own action sequences. He fought Triffids with a stick, climbed over rubble, dove through windows, all without proper safety equipment or training. In one scene, he was supposed to run across a burning room. No fireproof suit, no safety briefing, just a quick run fast and don't inhale. He did it in one take, singed his jacket, coughed for 10 minutes afterward, then asked what was next. Years later, he admitted it was the most physically demanding role of his career, not because of complex choreography, but because nobody knew what they were doing and everyone just kept improvising danger. Number 13. The opening scene in the hospital was filmed in an abandoned asylum. Production needed a sterile, institutional location that felt cold and unsettling. They found it in an old psychiatric facility outside London that had been shut down years earlier due to funding cuts. The building still had gurneys, medical equipment, even patient records scattered in forgotten offices. It was perfect for the film's tone, but the cast and crew hated it. Strange sounds echoed through empty corridors. Shadows moved where no one was standing. Several crew members refused to work there after dark, claiming they felt watched. The cinematographer dismissed it as nonsense until his camera malfunctioned 3 times in the same room for no apparent reason. Whether it was faulty equipment, drafty old buildings, or something else entirely, the atmosphere seeped into the footage. That opening hospital sequence feels genuinely eerie, not because of Triffids, but because the location itself carried a weight the cameras couldn't help but capture. Number 14. Jeanette Scott's screaming scene wasn't acting. During the lighthouse sequence where her character discovers they're surrounded by Triffids, she was supposed to deliver a controlled, dramatic scream. But when the director yelled action, the Triffid operators, who hadn't been properly briefed, lurched forward aggressively. One Triffid stinger mechanism, which had been jamming all day, suddenly worked perfectly and whipped towards Scott's face, stopping inches away. Her scream wasn't performance, it was genuine terror. The director, watching through the camera, saw her fear and immediately called cut. But when he reviewed the footage, he realized it was the most authentic moment they'd captured all week. He kept it in the film. Scott was furious, demanding they reshoot with proper safety protocols. The director apologized profusely, but quietly never scheduled that reshoot. Sometimes the best performances come from moments when actors aren't acting at all. Number 15. The film was nearly banned in Australia for promoting anti-survival propaganda. This sounds absurd now, but in 1963, Cold War paranoia ran deep. Australian censors screened the film and became concerned that its depiction of societal collapse, resource hoarding, and the breakdown of civilization could inspire panic or defeatist attitudes. One particularly zealous censor wrote a report claiming the film encourages citizens to abandon hope in crisis situations rather than trust a government response. The distributor had to submit detailed arguments explaining that the film was science fiction entertainment, not a documentary about emergency preparedness. After weeks of debate and minor cuts to dialogue suggesting government failure, the film was reluctantly approved with an A rating. The irony, the controversy generated publicity, and Australian audiences turned out in huge numbers, specifically to see what all the fuss was about. Number 16. One actor refused to get inside a Triffid costume under any circumstances. His name was never officially recorded, hired as a day player to operate one of the monster suits. But the moment he climbed inside and the head was secured, he panicked. Claustrophobia kicked in hard. He started hyperventilating, thrashing, screaming to be let out. The costume crew struggled to remove the headpiece as he flailed, eventually cutting through canvas to free him. He stumbled away gasping, pale, traumatized, collected his day's pay, and disappeared. They never saw him again. The production had to scramble, pulling in a stagehand who'd been watching from the sidelines. This stagehand, never trained as an actor or puppeteer, ended up operating Triffids in some of the film's most important scenes. His awkward, uncertain movements translated on screen as the creature's alien, unsettling gait. Sometimes the best monster performances come from people who have no idea what they're doing. Number 17. The color version almost destroyed the film's legacy. For decades, the Day of the Triffids existed only in color, and that's how most people saw it. But that wasn't how it was meant to be seen. The original theatrical release was in black and white, and the cinematography was designed specifically for monochrome. The shadows, the contrast, the lighting, all calibrated for a world without color. But in the 1980s, a film distributor decided color would make it more marketable to television audiences. They commissioned a colorization process that was crude by any standard. Triffids turned garish green, skies became artificial blue, and all the carefully crafted shadows were washed out into muddy gray, Critics who'd loved the original saw the colorized version and called it cheap, poorly made, visually incoherent. The film's reputation suffered for years until a restoration project in the 2000s finally remastered the original black and white print, revealing the stark, beautiful cinematography that had been buried under bad colorization. Number 18. The bus graveyard scene used real vehicles from a recent accident. Production needed a location that showed urban devastation. Abandoned vehicles piled up as blind drivers crashed in confusion. Building that from scratch was impossible on their budget. Then someone on the crew remembered reading about a massive pileup on the M1 motorway weeks earlier. Dozens of vehicles involved, multiple fatalities, a tragedy that shocked the nation. The wrecked buses and cars had been towed to an impound lot awaiting insurance processing. The production approached the lot owner with a proposal. "Let us film here, and we'll pay rental fees." The owner agreed. So, they shot one of the film's most haunting sequences surrounded by vehicles that had been involved in real deaths just weeks before. Cast and crew found it deeply unsettling. Bloodstains still visible on some seats, shattered glass everywhere, personal belongings left behind in the chaos. It wasn't a set. It was a recent crime scene repurposed for entertainment, and everyone felt it. Number 19. The film's score was composed in less than a week. Ron Goodwin, a prolific British composer, was brought in at the last possible moment when the original composer dropped out due to scheduling conflicts. He had 6 days to watch the rough cut, write a complete orchestral score, record it with a full orchestra, and deliver the finished music. Most film scores take months. Goodwin had less than a week. He worked around the clock, barely sleeping, writing themes on trains and restaurants, anywhere inspiration struck. The recording sessions were single takes, no time for revisions or multiple recordings. What you hear in the film is essentially a first draft performed live. And somehow, impossibly, it works. The score is eerie, propulsive, memorable. It carries scenes that might otherwise fall flat. Goodwin later said it was the most stressful week of his career, but also proof that creativity thrives under pressure, that sometimes the best work comes when there's no time to overthink, only time to create. Number 20. Post-apocalyptic. The film failed at the box office initially, then became a cult classic by accident. When The Day of the Triffids premiered in 1963, it was met with mixed reviews and modest attendance. Critics called it clunky, disjointed, a lesser adaptation of a great novel. It came and went from theaters quickly, considered a financial disappointment. But then something strange happened. Television discovered it. In the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, the film became a staple of late-night horror programming. A generation of viewers discovered it not in theaters, but in living rooms, watching alone in the dark as walking plants stalked blind survivors. The film's rough edges, its strange tonal shifts, its apocalyptic bleakness, all of it played better on small screens at midnight than it ever did in cinemas. Fan clubs formed, convention screenings sold out. And decades after its disappointing theatrical run, The Day of the Triffids was recognized as an influential atmospheric classic that helped to define British sci-fi horror. Bonus fact: there was a sequel script that never got made, and it was completely insane. Emboldened by the film's later cult success, a writer pitched a follow-up in the late 1970s. The treatment has been lost to time, but people who read it described it as utterly bonkers. It involved Triffids evolving intelligence, forming a collective consciousness, and attempting to communicate with surviving humans. There were underwater Triffid cities, Triffids learning to use tools, a final confrontation in Antarctica, where the last human stronghold faced a Triffid army. It read less like a sequel and more like a fevered dream. Producers passed immediately. The writer never worked in film again. But the legacy of that unmade sequel lives on in rumors and half-remembered pitch meetings, a reminder that sometimes the weirdest facts about a film are the things that almost happened but never did.